So hello there guys and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 Podcast. I hope that you guys are well and we're back again to preview the US Grand Prix. F1 returns to Austin, Texas for the second US race of the season. If you cast your minds back to earlier where we had the first race on the streets of Miami, of course next year we're going to be going to Las Vegas for a triple header of action in the United States of America. But for this season, of course, F1 returns to a new fan favourite, I believe. Certainly one of my favourite circuits on the calendar. It's a circuit that was designed not too long ago with the ambition to sort of emulate some of the highlights at other circuits, and I think we can all agree it's very much done that and also added its own unique flavour onto the F1 calendar, returning of course to the Circuit of Americas in Austin, Texas. Certainly a fan favourite and certainly a circuit I think is going to host another fantastic Grand Prix. If it's going to be as good as it was last season, I'm sure we will be in for a classic. Joining me on this episode of the podcast, as always, my co-host Courtney Pine and Lee Wannington. And in this episode, of course, we're going to be doing our normal preview, but we're going to be focusing on upgrades for Mercedes. We're going to focus on the developing story on Haas regarding who's going to be driving for them next season, as well as updates for Alfa Romeo, Alpine, and also a bit more on the cost cap breach from Red Bull. As you may remember from our episode last week, we still don't know to this point what is going to happen regarding Red Bull's punishment, and of course regarding the details of that particular breach, where the FIA still haven't quite disclosed to us at the moment, where there's a bit of a legal battle going on between them and Red Bull. Of course, if you are new to the show, we are the independent F1 podcast that gives you race reviews and previews and discusses all the latest news, talking points and gossip in the world of Formula One for your listening and viewing pleasure. So guys, of course, we should talk about the preview for the US Grand Prix, but first things first, I think we need to talk a little bit more following our discussion on the cost cap. Now, for those of you that missed that episode, we discussed the news that Red Bull, I should say, were found to be in breach of the 2021 budget cap. How much we don't know at this point. It's rumoured to be around just under 5%, which could be as much as $7.5 million to those of you doing the maths. But the realistic figure seems to be around $1 to $2 million. So not as much, but still a financial breach nonetheless. And we've had a lot of feedback from fans, journalists, pundits, and also from members of the F1 paddock as well. One in particular is Zach Brown, who's gone out and basically said that he believes Red Bull should receive a punishment fitting of their crime, pretty much in regards to the amount that they overspent. He believes that they should have a reduction in future spend and development by the amount that they overspent, as well as other punishments as well, not necessarily alluding to a points deduction, which some people have obviously expressed perhaps is a more fairer punishment to hammer home the cost cap infringement, but somewhere along the lines of a punishment that will deter others from breaching it in the future, and more importantly, preserving the legitimacy of the cost cap for future seasons. Toto Wolff, of course, has expressed discontent over what Red Bull have done, and has said it's important for them to make sure they get this right. Otherwise, the point of the cost cap will be meaningless, and he'd be prepared to spend massive amounts on future Mercedes projects if the punishment fitting is only a fine, quite frankly, which is some serious stuff nonetheless. Guys, obviously, just to sum that all up, interesting comments from Zach Brown and Toto Wolff in particular. I suppose the best way that we can look at this is sort of ask the question, how much pressure do you think the FIA are on right now to get this right? And also, do you agree with Zach Brown's comments regarding Red Bull, where he basically went along the lines and said that it was pretty much flat out cheating?
We obviously discussed it a lot in our recent episode, but you're right. The team principals are right. It has to be dealt with because it sets a precedent for other teams in the future. And also it needs to be dealt with because the longer it isn't dealt with, you continue to get the speculation, the rumour, the bad feeling towards Red Bull, the bad feeling, from other teams, back and forth. Red Bull, their working relationship with the other teams, it just causes a lot of issues within, the Formula One community. And God, have we been seeing that over recent weeks. But I think for Zach Brown in particular, look, McLaren are a team that are hoping to get back to the top. I think, some of the younger listeners, maybe they don't realise that McLaren were one of the biggest and most successful teams in Formula One history. They were dominating in the late 80s, early 90s. They were winning championships, obviously with Lewis Hamilton. They had the Button-Lewis Hamilton partnership where they were still a race-winning team. And they went on a decline. They're obviously hoping to get back to the top. And the promise that came with the cost cap regulations was that was going to help even the playing field for teams like McLaren to challenge for, race wins, pole positions, and hopefully championships. So it's something that's going to resonate with Zach Brown in particular. And obviously, I'm sure the likes of Alpine, Alfa Romeo, for example, feel the same way, because if they are hoping to catch up with the likes of Red Bull, they need the teams at the top to be following the rules in order for it to be fair. So you can understand why there's a great deal of frustration coming from Zach Brown. But at the same time, we need the answers. We don't know how much Red Bull have overspent. We still don't know. After how many weeks? It came out like a week, 2 weeks ago, and we still don't know. Red Bull having their name thrown through the mud, and it could be a really, really minor breach. We still don't know. It's very frustrating for us as fans, and I'm sure it's frustrating for the teams as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that a lot because... And I do, to some degree, I do sympathise with Red Bull in particular because, of course, there's been this, one thing that has been rumoured is the cost classification or how you sort of classify Adrian Newey's expenses. There's been rumours saying that he's been drafted in for contractor work via the Red Bull Valkyrie program and Red Bull Technologies rather than the Red Bull Formula One team. And, of course, using the expertise of someone like Adrian Newey to help design this 2022 car on top of the work he was doing in 2021. If it was possible for Red Bull to use that expertise but not necessarily classify or class that expertise as something that should be paid for within the Formula One budget cap, that is a huge, huge loophole that I'm sure a lot of teams would want clarification on, and perhaps this is something that is a sticking point between the FIA's interpretation and Red Bull's interpretation of the cost cap. I'm pretty sure that a lot of teams will be very much interested in the outcome of this because, of course, if Red Bull's interpretation is indeed correct in this instance and the FIA have made a mistake, teams left, right and centre are going to be doing this with some of their highest earners in ways to save money and use more of that to spend on development budgets, which, of course, in turn, Courtney, as you've mentioned already, is going to be a huge problem for some of the smaller teams who don't have the issue of trying to meet the budget cap in terms of saving money. Their issue is the opposite. They don't need to worry about it because they can't spend enough money to meet the budget cap. So the last thing they're going to want is a scenario like this to go in favour of Red Bull without fair retribution or fair punishment or covering or plugging up any loopholes which are going to give them more of a disadvantage and give the bigger teams more of an advantage going forward. So I do sympathise with Red Bull a little bit on this one. Their name's been dragged through the mud. As I said, look, they have breached the budget cap according to the FIA. If it has been found that they have cheated and by quite some margin, then of course fair punishment needs to be laid on them in order to preserve this cost cap. I think this is a brilliant initiative for Formula One racing going forward. I think it's a great equaliser for those that have versus those that haven't. But of course, it's critical for them to get this right. Lee, what are your thoughts on this one? Because I know you brought this to my attention before about this issue with Adrian Newey and how he's classified in the budget cap. As an example, I mean, it could be something completely different owing to stuff like this. So it's little things like this that the smaller teams just don't have compared to the big ones. So what are your thoughts regarding this? How critical is it for the FIA to sort of get this right? And of course, what do you make of Zach Brown's thoughts and Toto Wolff's thoughts on this going forward?
Well, firstly, on the Adrian Newey rumour, firstly, it's just a rumour going around. It may be completely irrelevant and could be completely false. But if it's to be believed, that Red Bull's argument is because he's a contractor, he's not a Red Bull employee, and therefore, no. So the FIA, the Red Bull argument is he's a Red Bull employee, and because therefore he's the third, he counts the top three salaries, he is exempt from the budget cap. But the FIA's view is he is a contractor, and the contractors do not count to your top three salaries and therefore are part of your budget, and therefore the cost cap. So in that sense, Formula One can't let Red Bull's definition be right, because as you said, you start getting the contractors in, because we pay you a high salary, we exempt you from, and we get these extra resource in that normally we wouldn't be able to afford under the budget cap. All right, yes, Haas ain't going to go hiring some dream tech because they don't have the money, but for like McLaren or Alpine or even Mercedes, just like, or Ferrari as well, I can't ignore them. You get some budget filling, and you get a contractor in to be a Red Bull, to be an employee, and all of a sudden they're outside the budget cap, and you've got more money to spend. So the FIA can't let Red Bull's definition be right, because it's going to upset the whole purpose of the cost cap. At least that's how I see it.
No, it's a very good point, because, this is Formula One, and the big thing that we love about Formula One, and sometimes also detest at the same time, is that some teams really do push the boundaries on what is acceptable and what isn't. And more often than not, I think we find in the modern era of Formula One that certain innovations, when it comes to the technical aspect, tend to be punished more than praised in one way or another. I mean, we can run a list of different things that teams have tried to bring forward, and sooner rather than later they've been outlawed because they haven't gone down as an interpretation that the FIA or F1 really wanted to have, or it was something that they didn't plug up, and rather than save the embarrassment, they accept the embarrassment, I suppose is a better way of putting it, they just completely get rid of it altogether. You can apply that logic to this budget cap to a degree, and this isn't me saying that Red Bull have been clever about their approach, but as you said, Lee, it's so important for the FIA to look at this interpretation, and not to attack Red Bull here, but if Red Bull's interpretation turned out to be correct, it sets a precedent which is only going to hurt the small teams and forever damage the concept of the budget cap and what it was intended to do going forward. So we're going to have to wait and see. It's quite interesting to see different interpretations. As I said, I think Toto Wolff's response was quite damning for those people that were kind of hoping that they could try and punish Red Bull in a small way with a fine or somewhere along a technicality, which allows them to, I suppose, retain the advantage that they've gained from doing this, but not be punished in a way that will deter other teams from spending more money. I don't think we're going to get that. I think it's going to have to be a big punishment, or you're going to see a scenario where Mercedes will say, well, look, this is the precedent that you've set. We're going to spend a ridiculous amount of money like we did in the past. Ferrari as well will probably look at this with the same level of intrigue and interest. And all of a sudden, you're back to where you were a few years ago. Mm-hmm. Teams spending upwards of £300 million a season on their car, and the other teams can barely almost match a third of that. And then you just end up with because it has leveled the playing field to a degree, and hopefully it will bear the results or bear fruit to what it's been doing all these years. We'll just have to wait and see. But it's still a new process and one they have to tighten up. And I think until we get more information, I think that's probably the last we should talk on the budget cap, because I'm sure a lot of people are probably bored of this by now, but it's something that's gripped this sport like nothing else before it for some time. So always got to love a little bit of drama on that one and entertain these sort of debates and conversations as we were. We'd rather talk about the cars going around the circuit than talk about money and other political, legal jargon and all of that stuff anyway. But moving on to some updates and some upgrades, and I think it's a good point where we can move on now to Mercedes. Now, Mercedes, of course, big weekend for them, and they're going to be bringing some upgrades. Now, we heard rumours about what those upgrade packages were going to be. From what we've heard, and I think one source that pointed it out was Formula Uno, or Formula 1A.Uno, whichever one you want to call it. They reported on their site in an article that Mercedes are going to be bringing some small changes to the nose cone, the front wing, a new floor, and also some lightweight bodywork components to help them get closer to the weight limit of 798 kilograms. It's around about a 5 kilogram weight loss, which is obviously going to be very, very impressive, and it's something that teams have struggled to really meet this season, with the exception of Alfa Romeo. I think we got to one point at the start of the season where teams were asking for the minimum weight limit to be increased to make it a bit easier for teams to match the weight limit, rather than trying to spend money to find lighter components that do the same job, or a better one to lose weight. So this is what Mercedes are going for this weekend. It's going to be the final raft of upgrades for them this season, one in which they hope will be a huge final step, not only for 2022 in terms of performance, but also help them on the way to producing a competitive car for 2023. And the W13, whilst will not be the most memorable car in the Mercedes, the Mercedes archives, if you like, for the success, it's certainly one that has been quite intriguing for its hidepod concept, which was originally mentioned by our friend Bryson Sullivan, who I'm sure, Bryson, if he's listened to this, hope you have a great weekend. He's going to be going to the US Grand Prix. So, brilliantly mentioned the hidepod concept. And it was a concept that intrigued a lot of people, us included. I think the start of the season, pre-season testing, when Mercedes originally tested their car that had side pods on and then brought this one to Bahrain, it had hardly any side pods whatsoever. It really intrigued a lot of people. I think the FIA went as far as saying when they expected this car that it wasn't really what they intended in the rules, and they went as far as to try and get it outlawed, and they couldn't really find anything that was illegal with it, so they allowed it. And Mercedes went on their own with this concept. I suppose ultimately you could consider this to be a failure. And I want to stress that you use that term loosely when it comes to Mercedes, because I know they obviously have very high standards of themselves. Failure is not a word you often associate with Mercedes, especially over the last decade. This car, by comparison, has obviously not lived up to the expectations. These upgrades seem to suggest that Mercedes are either exploring one of two things. Either one, they're going to be going down a route where they're going to try and optimize the current concept that they have to evolve in 2023, or they're going to try and make a bit of a revolution for 2023 going forward. So we'll be interested to see how this goes, but that's kind of what they're hoping these upgrades will achieve. Courtney Lee, you guys, obviously, no secret that you guys are Mercedes fans more than any other team in the paddock, which is absolutely fine, of course. We should stress to many people that listen to this show that probably don't appreciate the fact that we do have stakes in specific camps more than others, and there's nothing wrong in that, in the same way there's nothing wrong for you guys that weigh in to have your own interest in any team as well. It's all part of the fun with F1. But guys, of course, considering that you are invested in Mercedes' progress this season, and whilst it's one that's not really so far brought the success that you might have hoped, what are your thoughts regarding these upgrades? How important is it that Mercedes find immediate success with these upgrades and perhaps learn lessons that they can take into 2023?
What you just said there sums it up. Look, if you have a bad season, you want to take the positives from it, learn lessons, and hopefully improve next season. It's not going to be easy for Mercedes. Obviously, Red Bull in particular are in a league of their own. We don't know what's going to happen with the news that we've just been talking about. Red Bull are an unknown entity, but you do expect them to still be the team to beat in 2023. Ferrari will be very, very disappointed, expecting to bounce back. So none of those teams are going to be standing still. So it's really important for Mercedes to have a strong end to the season. They've admitted that they've realised where they went wrong with this year's concept. So, look, we know that Mercedes are very good at turning things around, but it's still going to be a tough ask for them. So, look, fingers crossed. They have a strong end to the season, and we have Mercedes up there again next season. And I'm not just saying that just because, we have our preferences, but we want to be seeing as many teams in a battle as possible. And I alluded to this earlier on in the season. If you're going to have a championship battle, you're going to want to have Mercedes there challenging Red Bull more than Ferrari, because Ferrari have proven this season you still can't trust them over the course of a season to maintain a title challenge. So I believe, just my opinion, that neutral fans who want to be seeing a good championship battle, ironically, should be wanting to have Mercedes back, even though they've we're sick of Mercedes dominating for years on end. They need Mercedes to get back on their A game in order to challenge Red Bull, because that's going to offer us a more entertaining season.
Yeah, I mean, there have been occasions this season where Mercedes have challenged Ferrari quite competitive and sometimes been faster than Ferrari, particularly in the race. And of course, Red Bull as well to a degree. Hungary was a good example where Mercedes were on it. I think the Dutch Grand Prix as well in Zandvoort, Mercedes were unfortunate not to win that race, even though it seemed inevitable at one point that Max Verstappen was going to win. At times they have been competitive, and at times they haven't. It's been very much up and down this season for Mercedes, and it's been very hard for them to find a decent trend. Lee, based on the comments I think Andrew Shovlin mentioned in an F1 article where he was basically talking about it being the final step of their aero development and lessons will be learned from this upgrade package that they can take into 2023. Where do you see Mercedes going on development? Do you feel that they're going to try and evolve their concept for next year, or do you feel perhaps they're going to try and go somewhere different and perhaps do what the likes of Aston Martin, Williams and McLaren did much earlier in the year and abandon that less is more concept and try to adopt something like the other teams have done?
Personally, I would be surprised if they completely abandon their concept. They may alter it, but I don't know if it's an old adage, but it's at least an adage I've used, is if you copy your competitors, you only be as good as they are. To be better, you have to think of something new. Maybe there's different ones out there, but that's at least how I would use it. So Mercedes know that if they just copied Red Bull's car, they would only be just as good as Red Bull. They wouldn't be better than Red Bull. So they need to have their own concept that makes them better than Red Bull. So the fact that they've admitted they know where they've gone wrong, they may try to implement it in this update, but it means next year that they'll obviously try and rectify where they went wrong in their car, and hopefully brings it closer. Because if they reset to a Red Bull concept, they're always going to be a year behind in development.
Mm-hmm.
Even with the current development rules and obviously aero time, etc., for finishing third in the championship, they'll have more than Red Bull. That will still take several seasons to close that gap if they completely abandon their concepts and be a year behind. So I don't fully see them abandoning it unless that the concept is the fundamental issue. But then I think they'll go somewhere else, not the same.
No, I agree with that because, I mean, I like the look of it as well. It's not the most elegant looking Mercedes that we've seen. It's certainly not the most elegant looking car we've got on the grid. But there's something there, and Mercedes have done a lot of good work this season to bring that car forward up the pecking order. I mean, at most races at the first half of the season, Mercedes were finding themselves fighting McLaren and Alpine rather than fighting Ferrari and Red Bull.
Even Haas at times.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, Austria was a prime example where we had a race-long battle in both the sprint and the main race between Sir Lewis Hamilton and Mick Schumacher. Something that I didn't expect to see this season, but ultimately it was at a point where Mercedes were really struggling. And ultimately, I will ask you what you think the number one issue Mercedes need to address for 2023 in a minute, but I do agree that if Mercedes decide to abandon what they've spent the best part of a year and a half, perhaps if you include the latter half of 2021, spend the best part of a year and a half trying to maximize this size zero concept. And perhaps this is something that is inherent from 2021, because over the course of the turbo hybrid era, one thing that we saw was these cars getting smaller and smaller and smaller in terms of the bodywork shape. They were trying to maximize the airflow going over the car and funnel to the Coke bottle area at the back of the car. This is something that Mercedes tried to optimize for 2022 with these new regs. They thought they'd found a loophole which allowed them to do that and would, in their minds, hopefully give them an advantage over everybody else. Something that went as far as Adrian Newey even saying that he did not see something like this coming. He did not expect this. It surprised him. And everyone thought, well, this could be something that surprised the great aero guru of Formula One. One of the most brilliant minds in F1 history didn't see this coming. And people thought, oh, wow, they got one over him. And in reality, it's gone the other way. They've not quite got it right. It's still a good car, but it's not quite the best of the field. So I absolutely agree that at the very, very least, if you try to copy someone else's concept, you're only going to be as quick as them, because you have to learn what they already know and improve on that. That's a really hard thing to do when you're already a year behind, or at least most of the year behind what Red Bull and the likes of Ferrari and a few other teams, even McLaren and Williams. Whilst Williams has not exactly shot up the pack, McLaren certainly have done at most races in the second half of the season. You would almost argue that McLaren would know more about this concept than Mercedes.
No, but I think you're right, Adam. Like, when you're talking about the things that Mercedes need to improve, I think that there are two things that stick with me the most. I think is how draggy the car is. We saw in Suzuka, Lewis was clearly faster than Ocon but you just couldn't overtake him in the overtaking areas. And we've gone into a season where overtaking's become a lot more easier. So Mercedes found themselves becoming, making trains with other cars behind them, even though they had the inherent pace on track. That was one of the issues. And also the other issue is their inability to warm up tyres properly. It's really hurt them in qualifying in particular. And, particularly through the European season where you get changeable conditions, Mercedes found themselves wanting. Usually, you have a look at Lewis Hamilton in particular. He's a specialist in the wet, but Mercedes couldn't utilise Lewis's strengths, one of his biggest strengths, which is wet weather running, because they weren't able to get heat into the tyre. So they were missing out on opportunities this season to make an impact in chaotic races because they weren't able to heat up the tyres properly. So the tyre warm-up is going to be a big thing for them to improve next season.
It's the opposite problem that Ferrari had this season, particularly in the second half of the season with the new TD, that car so good at getting those tyres warmed up very, very quickly, probably better than anybody else, which is why they're so good in qualifying. But over the race, they just wear their tyres out like crazy. Even in the wet weather, Charles Leclerc was chewing through his tyres to the point where he hardly had any tread on them at all. Whereas Mercedes and Sir Lewis Hamilton, and mind you, I think if anybody's going to be tired of seeing an Alpine in front of him this season, it's going to be Sir Lewis Hamilton. I mean, that guy has... Literally, he should buy an Oyster card at this point. The amount of times he's been on that bus, following it all the way around, whether it's Alonso or Ocon or maybe Pierre Gasly next season, heaven forbid for Lewis. Hopefully he's ahead of him next season. But my, oh my, he's going to get sick and tired of seeing that Alpine blocking his way every single time. So, no, I agree. I really agree. I think drag is going to be one area of their car Mercedes will really look to address. Hopefully these new upgrades will help with that. Of course, the weight limit being reduced on that Mercedes will help massively in terms of drag reduction. Lee, is there anything else on this car, W13, that you think would really need to be addressed to make it a championship contender in 2023?
I think you've already touched on what needs to really be improved on the car overall. I mean, I think you could actually acknowledge they may not have the full horsepower of the Honda or the Ferrari engine at the moment, although the gap is a lot closer than it was a few years ago between all the different engines. But the Mercedes engine is pretty damn reliable, which you could say if they had built a car, it'd be quite a formidable challenge, championship challenge, just the fact the reliability of this Mercedes engine. So on the other hand, just wanted to obviously acknowledge the Mercedes hard work on their power unit and how reliable it's been.
Yeah, it's not bad considering that they've gone for the size zero concept this season. I mean, this just shows how much of an amateur I am when it comes to aerodynamics, because Mercedes have obviously tried to tightly package their car more than anybody else, even found a loophole within the rules that's allowed them to do that with side pods, and yet somehow they have more drag than their competitors, which is beyond me at this point. But of course, I'm sure someone that knows what they're talking about would be able to explain it to me in layman's terms. Hopefully they will. And on top of that, their engine is so reliable, something that really plagued them last season to the point that where Bottas was taking engine penalties almost every single race, Mercedes were tactically taking engine penalties, because they knew the performance was so good. And now they've got the opposite problem where it's incredibly reliable despite all the reasons why it shouldn't be. Yet it's just not as powerful as the likes of the Red Bull engine and the Ferrari one, at least for the time being, of course, with reliability upgrades, which may allow them to run the engine a bit more aggressively. We'll have to wait and see, as per the engine regulations, which are supposed to be frozen. But you never know with these teams. A very, very clever bunch of people. So, let us know your thoughts, guys. I want to put this question in the comments. If you're watching this on YouTube or if you're listening to this on your favourite pod platform, head over to the YouTube page. Let us know in the comments if there's one thing that you would like to see changed on the Mercedes W13 to the W14, of course, its successor next season that will turn it into a championship contender. What would that be? What would you want to see changed to turn the Mercedes? Of course, if you're not a Mercedes fan, humour us on this one and just give it your best shot. I don't want people saying silly things like put an anchor on the back of it because I'm a Ferrari fan, although that would be quite funny, I suppose. But let us know what you think Mercedes should do to make their car world beater next season. Another team that's bringing some upgrades for this weekend's Grand Prix is Alfa Romeo, and this is an extension on what they did in Suzuka. I think in Suzuka they brought, a new front wing for the C42, And the second part of the development for this weekend is going to be some bodywork changes, which will allow them to exploit the performance from the new front wing. Now, guys, this is a team that doesn't usually upgrade very often. It's usually in short bursts and stints. It's a hallmark to what's been going on this season. Teams have not been able to bring upgrade packages every single week because they can't afford them, unless, of course, it's Red Bull. But that said, just a joke, guys, relax. But that said, it's a big weekend for these upgrades to work, because this is a team right now that looked very much set on finishing in P6. They scored a lot of their points in the first half of the season. I think they've only scored, unless I'm mistaken, was it 1 point in the second half of the season? I think that was Zhou Guan Yu. 51 of those points in the first half of the season. I might be wrong, but the long story short is that Alfa Romeo have not really been in the points that often in the second half of the season. It's really hurt them to the point where now Aston Martin, and you could argue even Haas and AlphaTauri to a degree, are really breathing down their necks. And just to show the significance of this, prize money for this season, according to SI.com, for P6 it's $84 million, P7 $75 million, P8 $71 million, and P9 $66 million. Between P6 and P7, $9 million. Now, for an outfit like Aston Martin, that's pocket change. You know, Lawrence Stroll, whilst he would love to see more of a return on his investment, $9 million is not something that the team are going to focus on as a prime target for performance. They really want to get the results because they want to win things in Formula One. Of course, a bit of extra money is going to be nice for them, but they're not a team that I'm thinking is really concerned about the money. Alfa Romeo, on the other hand, very much is. And whilst their future in the sport is very much up in the air, whether they're going to continue as Alfa Romeo beyond 2026 or whether it's just going to become Audi remains to be seen, or maybe something else, we'll have to wait and see. It's a real humdinger for them. I know, strange word to describe that, but I suppose, guys, how important for Alfa Romeo is it to have a good weekend this weekend? And for the rest of their season, they really need these upgrades to work, don't they?
Oh, they really do. I think with Alfa Romeo this season, it's been a case of them being caught napping. I think they probably thought they had sixth sort of covered. They'll go into the second half of the season, effectively be on the beach. Like, I mean, Valtteri Bottas seems to be bored out of his nut at the moment. So he's just been sort of turning up the way that Kimi used to towards the end of his career. Turn up, do the job, go home, get the odd point here and there. Job's a good one. But yeah, particularly Aston Martin, they've been really impressive in the last few races, getting some eye-catching results. So it's been a wake-up call for Alfa Romeo. And in a way, I'm glad that it's happened, because you want to be seeing teams fighting to the very end of the season. You know, there's a slight disappointment that the Drivers' Championship has ended so early. And you look further down the grid, you go, right, where we got to see some battles in these final races. The McLaren Alpine battle is certainly a possibility. The Mercedes Ferrari, tiny possibility of that still being a thing, even though I do think Ferrari have that covered. So then you look further down, and that's where the next big battle is. And right now, Aston Martin have the momentum, so Alfa Romeo need to respond, and they're obviously attempting to do so from this weekend moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't long ago where Valtteri Bottas was a regular in P7. I think in the Miami Grand Prix, he was fighting there with the Mercedes until, of course, he had an issue which put them through. But it really is a problem for Alfa Romeo, and they need this. They really, really do. I mean, the threat from Aston Martin in particular is very real right now. Stroll and Vettel having great races last time out of Japan. They've been really challenging the points. It's a good race car. I, for one, right now feel that if these upgrades don't work as intended for Alfa Romeo, I could very easily see Aston Martin overtake them in the championship. At least them. AlphaTauri might be a challenge, but yeah, definitely Aston Martin. I think they could really do something. Lee, right now, what do you think the problem has been for Alfa Romeo in the second half of the season? Because they've just fallen down the pecking order. As I said, I already mentioned that development has been quite scarce for them. But there have been mistakes from the drivers. There have been reliability issues. There have been occasions where Bottas, as Courtney said, has probably checked out for most of this season, and perhaps is more interested in taking pictures of his backside rather than sorting out that Alfa Romeo backside and getting in the points again, as he was so often at the start of the season.
Well, firstly, on the the upgrades. I mean, I do wonder if they're bringing a sauna upgrade to Valtteri's car, because he seems to perform his best when he's in a sauna. That'd be quite an opportunity for him to strip off. I know you've got the fire.
I got it in there somehow. I was always going to get a mention of Valtteri in there somewhere.
No, in all seriousness, no, they do need the upgrades to work for the reasons you said. But in the back of their mind, I don't think they'll be as concerned about if they lost the position to Aston Martin as they would have been a couple of years ago. And that's because obviously they're Alfa Romeo to the end of next year. But then I would fully imagine come 24, they will start to see some Audi money coming into the team. Because obviously Audi may be joining the sport in 26, but they're going to obviously want the development car to be strong. They want to make sure the staffing and the resources are all up to scratch when Audi join. Obviously, any facilities, they want to make sure they're obviously championship fighting worthy, equivalent to the Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari. So there's going to be a lot of investment from 24. So the long term, or the mid to long term future is secure for the team. So $9 million a couple of years ago would have been, that's annoying. We've lost $9 million. Oh, it's inconvenient, but in a year we'll be getting some extra bucks anyway, which will be really, really nice. So they obviously try their best to keep it, but I don't think it's as vital for the team as it would have been a few years ago.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And as I said, it's not as important, but it's at this point in time, it could go a long way towards what they do next season. I mean, that money, that extra $9 million could go towards their development. Whereas Aston Martin, I don't really see their plans being affected one way or the other. It could just depend on how nice the Christmas party ends up being at the end of the season. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, well, if they don't want it, they could always give it to us.
Do you know what? If there's one Christmas party I wouldn't mind going to, it's the Aston Martin one. I'm sure Lawrence Stroll doesn't spare much expense on that one. And it's something that I don't think Christmas parties are part of the budget cap, although I suppose we'll have to wait and see. I mean, we talk about catering stuff. That was something that was thrown at Red Bull as well. All the catering jokes and everything else, but I will spare their blushes on that in this podcast. I think people that go on social media have seen enough of that already, and plenty of great ones. And of course, there are some brilliant ones. I won't share them because wouldn't do them justice on this show, and we don't want to bash Red Bull too much on this one while this is going on. I mean, but they could be innocent. I don't know. Who knows? But yeah, it is an interesting one. I was looking back actually at the Alfa Romeo results, Lee, while you were talking about that, and I was right. They've only scored 1 point in the second half of the season, and that was at the Italian Grand Prix, where Zhou finished P10. The last points before that, either you want to guess where that might have been?
I'm gonna go and say somewhere like Azerbaijan.
That would have been my guess.
It's not far off. It was Canada. I think like the 7th.
Wow.
Yeah, Canada, where they got double points.
I don't know how good your geography is, Adam, but Azerbaijan and Canada are very far apart.
Not if you're making the F1 calendar, it isn't. Because you can make that jump. I feel, isn't that one of the steps? Probably, there you go.
It wasn't the joke I was going for. Just meant the geographical, not the actual calendar sequence.
No, I know. But obviously, if you're doing the F1 calendar, geography doesn't really matter to you.
No,
you go there, it's fine. It's like 10,000 miles. The Proclaimers walked it, it's fine. 20 times over, it's fine. They'll be fine.
God, you're such an old man.
Oh, you know what? I try. I try. But look, another team we should talk about this weekend that seems to be quite buoyant is Alpine. Now, Alpine fighting right now for P4 in the Constructors' Championship. They had a great weekend last time out in Japan, responding to McLaren's brilliant performance in Singapore. They've got the advantage once again, and Alpine have been piping up again about their new car for 2023. There was an article in motorsport.com where they said that they are significantly up with the development of its 2023 F1 car compared to this year's Challenger. Lauren Rossi, the CEO at Alpine, was saying it's very good, it's very exciting. And that's quite encouraging because this is a team that's done a great job despite all the naysayers, us included, about their management structure. They have built a very good Formula One car. It's probably been, I'd say, probably the only car, with the exception of Ferrari and Red Bull, where you can literally just plug it in and it goes quick everywhere. With respect to a few others. And I suppose the one question I have to say about Alpine is, upon hearing this news, is that if it is reliable and they actually have built a very, very good car for 2023, What is it with Fernando Alonso and leaving a race team which is on the verge of producing a car that might be capable of his abilities? Because that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah. But with Fernando Alonso, that's been the biggest issue. You know, it's been his lack of patience with projects, leaving, and then obviously other drivers benefit from, you know, those projects bearing fruit. And it's why Fernando Alonso only has 2 world championships. If he was a bit more patient with some of the projects, he might have had a couple more under his belt. But at the end of the day, you know, that's all part of the game. You know, Lewis Hamilton is always the example. When he went to Mercedes, and everyone thought he was a madman, going, including myself. And then he proved us all wrong with winning consecutive world championships. So that's very much a Fernando Alonso issue. It's no coincidence. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, he seems to put in all that work and all that feedback that he gives to the team in order to improve the car going forward. And I know drivers have a relatively important job in doing that so that teams can understand the weaknesses. And you imagine Fernando Alonso is as good as anybody at doing that. It just feels like if he stuck around a little bit longer, he can enjoy the efforts of his labour, I suppose, in that regard. But it's quite interesting. Of course, it might just all be conjecture at this point. It's all relative, because everybody's always buoyant about their prospects for next season. We never actually see what goes on behind the curtain until the cars do the runs in pre-season testing. And of course, we find out then who actually has been doing well and who's just been exaggerating their prospects and end up falling woefully short. This weekend, of course, Alpine don't need to worry about 2023. Their focus is on 2022. Ocon and Alonso doing very, very well, as you pointed out already. Courtney Ocon really being a thorn into Lewis Hamilton's side at Suzuka. Fernando Alonso also doing a great job there. Where do you see this going between McLaren and Alpine? Because this does seem, once again, very quickly the advantage has gone back into Alpine's corner. I personally feel that this could be the last opportunity for McLaren to really put a dent in them. I think they've surrendered their advantage very, very quickly. I can't see Alpine throwing this away, quite frankly, because it's very rare that they have reliability problems.
No, there's two reasons for it. First of all, that you've already alluded to the fact that Alpine are sort of so much more consistent compared to McLaren, and also, again, I've been repeating myself a lot this season on this topic, but the other important point is that both lead drivers are doing the job, whereas McLaren only have one driver. McLaren have one of the most talented young drivers on the grid, but he's the only driver currently doing the job. So that's the problem. And obviously McLaren will be hoping the next season having 2 young talented drivers on the grid will make a difference for them. But for Alpine, they've got the finished article in Fernando Alonso. Ocon's definitely improved this season, and they've got the consistent car there to do the job. So, you know, barring any sort of surprise upgrades from McLaren, yeah, I think you're right. I think right now the advantage certainly is with Alpine.
What about you, Lee? We've obviously talked a lot about Alpine already and saying it's pretty much a plug-in-and-play car that's quick almost everywhere. What are McLaren's prospects for this weekend compared to Alpine? Do you think that they can match Alpine on this circuit, or do you feel that it could be another one of those weekends where they need things to go wrong for Alpine in order for McLaren to make some headway?
This weekend, I believe, I agree with you, it'd be McLaren's last chance to really score some strong points against Alpine for a few races. I think there'd be a very interesting fight between the two teams because the circuit should suit both cars, from what I understand about obviously their car strengths and obviously the circuit layout. So McLaren would obviously need things to go their way and less so Alpine's. But I think we're going to have an interesting fight on our hands. But Alpine probably also going this weekend going, if McLaren outscore us, we've got 2 high altitude tracks coming up. Our engine will normally perform better than the Mercedes engine, which the Mercedes engine historically struggles in Mexico and Brazil. Well, no, let's say it's a Sir Lewis last year. Mm-hmm. It didn't struggle at all. But because the high altitude, the Mercedes engine doesn't really like the less dense air. So McLaren will be hindered. So they will know they need to outscore Alpine and will try their damn hardest to do so this weekend.
Yeah.
Because if they don't, that's it. Alpine have got this.
Yeah, I do think right now McLaren have to strike while the iron is hot at the moment. I mean, it's not much to separate them, although the championship has swung back in Alpine's favour. As I said already, I for one think it's Alpine's to lose at this point, but as we've seen already, it can be won and lost very, very quickly. So McLaren at this point just have to stick in there and hope for the best. A quick note on Alpine before we move on to the final part with McLaren. A few nice stories going on there, of course. Quite interesting to see Pierre Gasly, who obviously is now being confirmed to be joining Alpine for 2023. A few nice little moments between him and Esteban Ocon on the socials. Of course, the point of recording this last night, we had the Ballon d'Or ceremony for football, which Karim Benzema, the French footballer, was awarded the European Footballer of the Year. Both Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon were in attendance. I don't know if you guys saw this, a few little photos on their socials. Interestingly, they were sat next to each other, but they cropped each other out of their own photos again. I'm not sure if that was a play on a joke or something that they did before at a similar ceremony, or just a bit of light-hearted jest, and perhaps maybe a sign of things to come, or perhaps just a bit of light-hearted fun. What do you guys reckon?
Look, it's all light-hearted fun now, but I'm confident that come next season when they're competing, you know, having two drivers from a similar age from the same country, obviously driving for a French as well. I just think, look, we've got all the ingredients there for a fantastic battle between these two. And it's actually one of the things I'm looking forward to most about next season. I just think it's going to kick off between them two, and I can't wait.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm very much looking forward to it. I think that's going to be the inter-team rivalry that will intrigue me the most on the 2023 grid. That's the one we're going to get the most of the stories from. On McLaren, a few little nice stories, of course, first of which we should talk about. Former world champion Mario Andretti driving a 2013 spec McLaren with the modern day livery, of course, at the Laguna Seca, probably one of the most famous tracks in the US, at 82 years young. That was a pretty heartwarming story. Something that we heard Mario and Zach Brown talking about a little while ago, actually. So I think it was in Miami that long ago, talking about getting him in a Formula One car. Finally happened. Did you guys see the footage?
Yeah, I saw it.
Yeah, brilliant.
It was great to see.
He was certainly giving it some.
That's the thing, but every time I hear those V8s, I'm like, oh, can't you just bring them back?
Yeah, that is very true. I must admit the noise was very pleasing compared to the current. I mean, the cars sound okay today, but they're not quite what they used to be. Of course, you know, he was driving on the track with the likes of, was it Pato O'Ward, driving in a more modern McLaren, of course, and also a McLaren from yesteryear, one that Mika Hakkinen was also driving around the circuit well into his 50s as well. So nice bit of classic McLaren stuff there. Lee, what do you reckon? Mario Andretti trying to get himself a seat for 2023 whilst there are some available?
No, I don't think he's trying to get a seat for 2023. I think he's very much concerned about getting a team together on the Andretti name.
Maybe wants to drive. Maybe wants to drive for the team.
Well, if you're in the team, you pick the drivers.
Well,
exactly.
This is it. It's almost like F1 2022, my team going on, and Andretti enters himself in. I've seen Stranger Things, and I mean, maybe we'll get him doing a young driver test at 82 years of age. You know, if Fernando Alonso can do it when he's past 40, then, you know, sky's the limit, quite frankly. What is 82? It's just a number age these days. Of course, he won't be able to do that for McLaren this season, a young driver test. That has been reserved for Alex Palou and Pato O'Ward. Alex Palou, of course, former IndyCar champion. Pato O'Ward, of course, another successful driver on the Indy scene as well. I think it's going to be Alex Palou driving in FP1 this weekend for McLaren. Pato O'Ward at Abu Dhabi. And great opportunities for those guys, obviously with interest of trying to get into Formula One in the future. We've had this debate with IndyCar very recently with Tom Gaymore, actually, who gave us great insight on this one. One thing I do want to point to, though, regarding this announcement is that, of course, whilst we expected it to be the case, it does leave a bit of a hole regarding Oscar Piastri's experience, because he's not had a proper outing for Alpine in a Formula One session yet. He's not going to get one, of course, because he's moving on to McLaren. This does have the potential to give him a bit of a setback going into 2023, given that these new cars have been going, the teams and drivers have been going at them for a year now. He really is going to be under the cosh to get up to speed for 2023.
Yeah, I think obviously he'd really benefit from being in practice sessions, but I don't know the schedule. But I remember last season they did the young driver Pirelli test, didn't they? Straight after the final race in Abu Dhabi. So maybe that would be the opportunity for Oscar to have a chance to,
I doubt it, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's the thing. But you're right. He does need that opportunity because obviously these 2022 cars have a completely different feel about them. So he's gonna find it difficult. But the situation with McLaren is intriguing to say the least, because obviously with Zach Brown's American influence, there is this sort of IndyCar connection, and you do get the feeling he wants to get an IndyCar driver in at some point. So I think for Oscar Piastri, I think he's already in not a difficult situation as such, but I think he's going to be under pressure. Yeah, he's going to be under pressure to prove himself instantly, because that second seat of McLaren is going to be sort of looked at from IndyCar drivers, and Zach Brown is obviously somebody who would encourage that in the future.
Yeah, I think so. Of course, as we were talking about already, it's going to be. I don't think he's going to be driving in the Pirelli test or young driver test, because of course he'll still be under contract with Alpine.
That's
when
true.
It goes, and we've seen stuff in the past about teams being reluctant about letting drivers partake in that test for their new team. I know there was a big argument with Daniel Ricciardo when when he was leaving Renault to drive for McLaren, or something like that, or something to do with Red Bull going to Renault. So, silly stuff like that. And a few other drivers obviously struggling as well to get the same treatment. So I can't see Alpine allowing Oscar Piastri, after everything that's gone on, to drive the McLaren. I mean, that would be some show of respect. Maybe Alpine will be more lenient and generous if they beat McLaren in the Constructors' Championship and say, well, here you go, you can have him. We don't really need him anymore. But I would be very surprised if that were the case. Let's move on to another story regarding Haas. Now, Haas right now have been going through a bit of a tug of war from a few drivers in particular regarding that second seat. We know Kevin Magnussen is signed up for the medium term. We know there have been rumours regarding who's going to be driving that second seat. Right now, it does seem to be a straight-out fight between Mick Schumacher, who currently occupies that seat, and Nico Hulkenberg. There are certainly some arguments to be made on both sides. We focused a lot in previous discussions on what Mick Schumacher brings to the table in terms of his future potential, not to mention the fact that he does come with a hefty repair bill. That has been echoed by comments from Gene Haas, no less, basically saying, in his own words, from an article from SI.com again, and this is a quote from Gene Haas, "I think Mick has got a lot of potential, but he costs a fortune. He's wrecked a lot of cars that have cost us a lot of money that we just don't have." He then went on to say, but based on Schumacher's crashes, if you bring us points and you are Verstappen and you wreck cars, we will deal with it. But when you are at the back and you wreck cars, that's very difficult. Gunther Steiner even was talking about other drivers. He mentioned Ricciardo, saying that if he's interested, he shouldn't be shy to call him up, as an outside chance. Not sure if Ricciardo's a realistic contender for this one. But that has been kind of the hallmark with Mick Schumacher, the argument to be made. A driver that definitely has potential. On occasion, he has shown that he's got a lot of pace. I think recently he's been faster than Kevin Magnussen, but he does come with that risk of extra money being spent because he spends more time in the wall than they would have liked. So what do you make of those comments, especially coming from Gene Haas, who's obviously the man that bankrolls this Haas team, obviously well aware of Mick's capability, but is also well aware of the price tag that comes with him through, damage and crashes. It is a bit worrying to hear the big boss, the one that signs the paychecks, mention that quite openly, rather than sort of defend his current driver.
And it's the timing of it as well. There's obviously talk of there being an announcement this week coming from the team, and it could possibly be Mick Schumacher's replacement being announced. It's tough for Mick because his form has improved recently, but what Gene Haas is saying is completely right. They finished last in the Constructors in recent times. They've really been struggling. They've had a slight upturn in form this season, and they don't have the budget to be dealing with accidents. So when you're sort of one of the teams sort of dwindling towards the bottom, you need reliable drivers. You get that with Kevin Magnussen. And if the rumours are be true and they are looking at someone like Nico Hulkenberg, he is that. He is Mr. Reliable. He is perfect for a team like Haas. That, if the opportunity comes around to get the odd point here and there, Nico Hulkenberg will be there in a chaotic race, generally speaking. and he does. He generally does keep the car out of trouble. So Nico Hulkenberg is probably the type of driver that Haas are looking for, and the fact that they've been sort of so public and the timing of it all, it doesn't bode well for Mick Schumacher.
Yeah, very true. And we did see a couple of outings for Nico Hulkenberg for Aston Martin this year. Drove in Jeddah. Didn't he drive in Bahrain as well? I think it was at the start of the season, because I know Vettel got COVID, didn't he? So I think Hulkenberg stepped in for him for a couple of races. And Hulkenberg wasn't too bad. You know, he was quite close to Lance Stroll. I think he beat him in Jeddah, unless I'm mistaken. Probably not, but he was very, very close at least. So it goes to show that if Hulkenberg has the time to get used to the car and everything else, that he can offer the pace, at the very least, the pace that you kind of need to be competitive. But at the same time, as you already mentioned, Courtney, doesn't come with a hefty repair bill attached to something that Mick Schumacher definitely has to improve on. Obviously, just looking at the championship point situation with Haas right now, currently in P8, fighting with Alfa Tauri at the moment to avoid dropping down to P9. I think their better result in Bahrain being the only difference between the two for Kevin Magnussen. What are your thoughts on this one, Lee? Is there... I mean, I know there's an element of truth to what Gene Haas and what Gunther Steiner has said about Mick Schumacher, but do you feel perhaps there's a little bit of a resentment brewing there to this driver, where they may feel that they could be a lot further up in this Constructors' Championship right now if it weren't for the crashes and mistake that Mick Schumacher had back when they had a very competitive car at the start of the season, because it was very much the Kevin Magnussen show. And if Mick Schumacher had been able to convert more point-scoring positions rather than crashing the car like what he did at Jeddah in qualifying and Monaco, for example, they could be fighting Alfa Romeo and Aston Martin for P6 rather than looking over their shoulder at P9. And that's a hefty difference in prize money, almost 20 million between P9 and P6.
Yeah, I mean, I think the resentment's already there, to be honest. I've said for quite a while that I don't think Mick's going to keep his seat at Haas. And I think it's all because of when, as you said, Valtteri was Mr. 7 of 77. He was scoring the maximum like for Alfa Romeo. It's that consistency. But with like Haas, Kevin Magnussen was doing it. And he'd been out of the sport for a year. And Mick had been there. So Mick should have really stepped up, like Valtteri coming into the new team. Well, he was a new team, but coming in and going, look, this is what I can do. I've been here a year. And Kevin is completely not worthy, but he didn't. He crashed. And Kevin was fighting with Valtteri for the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, especially in the early part of the season. And Sir Lewis and George, at particular races, and times Kevin lost his front wing to Sir Lewis, and the amount of times they got close on the circuit. So, of course, if Mick could be further up, and I think that's it. They've gone, we spent all this money last year. We completely sacrificed last year for this year. And you've crashed the car and not given us any points. There is resentment. And I think that the decision has been made long ago that he's going to go, and they were giving him the opportunity to prove them wrong. But I think he's gone, and it's very likely to be Nico Hulkenberg, who brings his own sponsorship in. Obviously, Mick brings his sponsorship in, but Nico also brings in sponsorship. So, yeah, I think it's going to very likely be Nico.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, you talk about sponsorship. I mean, Hulkenberg being a German driver as well, there's a good chance that, you're not going to be short of attracting German sponsors anyway. So perhaps this is a situation where Haas have got down to the final two, and really it's up to them. Perhaps for once they finally hold all the cards in terms of who they want to bring in out of these two drivers. I mean, Lee, you've obviously made it already apparent that you think it's going to be Hulkenberg. Courtney, if you were Gene Haas or Gunther Steiner, whoever's making the decision, where would you go? Would you go with Schumacher or would you go with Hulkenberg?
Right now, it'd be Hulkenberg, and I feel there's a sense of inevitability. Maybe as soon as Wednesday or Thursday, we might find out.
Yeah, it could be. Of course, by the time you guys hear this on Thursday morning when it comes out, we could very much be very close to a decision. I mean, I've said for a long time now that I think there is more to come from Mick Schumacher. I don't expect him to be a world champion or maybe even a race winner, but I certainly think there's a very, very solid Formula One driver in there. It just needs to come out and be more consistent. It has been a baptism of fire for him. It's not been easy, but he is a driver that has a track record of learning from his mistakes and becoming a much more competitive driver. But this is the ultimate test for that in Formula 1. This isn't Formula 2 or Formula 3. The competition is so much more intense and so much better than it is, for some time. And also, you got to remember we're in a cost cap era now. Before the cost cap, perhaps it wouldn't have been an issue for Mick Schumacher having the odd crash here. Not saying that Haas is struggling to meet the cost cap, but of course, in an environment where you need to try and be as efficient as possible, the last thing you want is a quick driver that's crashing. You want a driver that perhaps Hulkenberg isn't as quick as Mick right now, but if he finishes more races than Mick and converts more points opportunities than Mick does, that's kind of what you want. You want that solid driver, and Hulkenberg was proven to be that. So it's a very hard sale right now, one way or the other, but ultimately one that Haas are going to make. If Hulkenberg is confirmed, and I'm stressing this is a big if right now, because we don't know. It could happen on Thursday. Haas may decide to wait a little bit longer. It sounds like the sort of thing that they might want to announce, but perhaps they want to wait until the end of the season where they have the luxury of doing that. But if it is Hulkenberg, if you're Williams, would you take a punt on Schumacher, or would you continue to wait for Logan Sargent to get the super license points that he needs, which looks very likely at this point with one round to go in the F2 Championship?
I think Williams would be looking at Logan Sargent. Obviously, he's obviously a guy that they've invested a lot of time and probably money into. And if you're going from a team like Haas who have these financial issues, you're going to go to Williams that are in exactly the same scenario. They won't want to employ somebody that's going to be constantly having crashes. They've just moved on Nicholas Latifi, that's just been doing that very same thing. So they're not going to want to replace. I don't want to be too harsh on Mick Schumacher, but they don't want to replace a guy that has a reputation for crashing a lot with another driver that has a reputation for crashing a lot. So I don't think that's a move that Williams would be too keen on.
Yeah, very, very good point. Lee, what about you?
Right, I mean, I've said for a while that I think Mick will be out of Haas, but on the other hand, I've also been saying I think he's going to end up at Williams. And for me, I completely understand and agree with Courtney's points. Well, I don't agree with it, but I understand the points. But I think he will end up at Williams. I do think that, as you said, Adam, I think there's a good driver in him. If it's a Ralph or a Michael, I think there's still yet to be determined. But he needs to learn. And I think maybe Haas as a team, maybe it's not the right environment, and the Williams being the more right environment and being alongside Alex, it may give him a position to refine his craft a bit more. And I still think that there's going to be some Mercedes links to Mick keeping his seat in Williams. So not that he's with Mercedes, but the family links, Schumacher with links with Mercedes. I think he's going to end up at Williams. Yeah,
very, very good point. I mean, we could see Mick in a Mercedes reserve role. Mercedes are on the lookout for that. Perhaps that's something that might entice Mick's Schumacher. Of course, one Mercedes young driver, Kimi Antonelli, doing a great job in the junior series, being a champion. I think a junior Formula 4, unless I'm mistaken. But I think they're going to have to wait a while for Kimi to come along. So Mick would be a good placement in the interim, of course, for a few years at least. Obviously, Mick would want a seat in Formula 1. It's a hard one. I mean, if I was at Williams, I'd take a punt. But then, of course, you've got an American driver in Logan Sargent who's doing a great job in F2, has been very, very quick, almost has the adequate number of super license points. It makes absolute sense for an American company to bring him into the fold. And, I'm sure there'll be plenty of marquee value with that. The one person, I suppose, that we need to ask, that we need to get back on the show to ask this question is good old Mystic Morgan himself, George Morgan, because he was the guy that first predicted Oscar Piastri snubbing Alpine to go to McLaren out of the blue, if I remember rightly. So I might have to give Mystic Morgan a call once he's finished commentating this season to come back on and let us know who he thinks will be in that Williams seat, or maybe the Haas seat if we haven't had an announcement. So George, if you're listening, get in touch and let us know in the comments as well for this episode, and we'll have you back on the show next time. Of course, we should get into the predictions. We haven't talked too much about Ferrari and Red Bull. Obviously going to be the two leading contenders for the race this weekend. Assuming Mercedes are in the picture as well with their upgrades, if they work as intended, where do you see this race being won and lost? And of course, who do you think is going to come out on top this weekend?
It's going to be another Red Bull one too. I know it's a boring thing to say. I just think Red Bull are running away with it. Perez has found some form. Ferrari are struggling with, with obviously having too much heat in their tyres, so the race pace has sort of fallen off. So I do think this is going to be a Red Bull 1-2.
What about you, Lee?
I was going to do a sarky answer to your question about it's always the finishing line, the person on top of the podium is going to be the person that's on top. But then I thought I wouldn't say it, so but I got it in anyway. But no, this weekend, what I have heard rumours about engine penalties. So I think there may be some penalties that may actually end up defining the result. If they are the case, if the rumours that I've read about is true, there'd be a Max engine penalty and a Charles engine penalty. So that does open up the door for a Mercedes if the upgrades work. I don't agree it being a Red Bull 1-2. I think this is Mercedes last year, a sneaky win. That's the only thing I would say on it. But I think from a Red Bull perspective, they're going to be all behind Sergio securing number 2 in the championship. And I wouldn't be, not that Max would give up a win, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a 1-2 position that there may be some discussions about, and Max being the first, about giving up the win for Sergio to get the extra points to secure second in the championship.
Well, this is interesting because I was actually going to raise this point. Could you guys see a scenario? I mean, Lee, you've already mentioned it already, but if you could see a scenario where Red Bull are 1-2, Max Verstappen, of course, leading the Grand Prix with Perez behind him, could Max play the team game whilst the Constructors' Championship, it's only a matter of when, not if at the moment. They're so far ahead. I think it's like 150, something crazy like that right now. Could be wrapped up this weekend, quite possibly. Or haven't really talked about the permutations for that. Not that I know them off the top of my head, but could we see a scenario where Max Verstappen gets out of the way to allow Sergio the win? Not to mention the fact that this is one of 2 sort of home races for Checo. I mean, the Mexican Grand Prix is the proper home one where I'm sure he'd love to win that race. But America, there's going to be a huge Mexican contingent out there to support Checo. I remember him getting the biggest roars of anybody last time out in Texas for that. I'm sure they'd love to see him win there. Could we see a scenario where Max lets Checo win this weekend? Remembering, of course, Max is 1 win away from equaling the record of most wins in a season set by Michael Schumacher and Sebastian Vettel.
It's possible. I'd say it's more likely if Perez is leading and Max is on faster tyres on the last stint. I can't see Max relinquishing the actual lead. So I think it depends on the positions they're on, like on track, come the final stint.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, we saw this sort of happen at Spain, where their championship situation was a little bit different and they were both actually very close to each other. I think it was Checo could have led the championship if he'd have won that race, but let Max go as Red Bull had asked him to, and obviously the rest is history for this season. We certainly can't knock them for how things have turned out for them. They seem to have managed that very, very well. Unlike, of course, their rivals Ferrari this season, who, whilst the Drivers' Championship is officially over, although in truth it had been over probably since as long ago as the French Grand Prix, where Charles Leclerc crashed out leading the Grand Prix, it's going to be an interesting one for Ferrari. Obviously, they're still going to want to be competitive. They're still going to want to win races. They still believe they can get another win or 2 before the season is out. Mattia Binotto, obviously, putting a lot of work into the 2023 car. I think he's going to be at Maranello watching from there whilst he oversees the technical project for next season. What are your prospects for Ferrari this weekend? Given how the circuit normally behaves, this could prove to be another difficult race for them on tyre management compared to their rivals.
Yeah, I do believe that Ferrari will still be the second fastest team. Obviously, Mercedes are very much an unknown entity with these upgrades coming. But let's say, hypothetically speaking, the Mercedes upgrades don't work. You fancy a solid race, someone like Carlos Sainz in particular, who's hasn't had the best of luck of it recently. So it could be an opportunity for Ferrari to bounce back in some capacity. So I do expect Ferrari to be there or thereabouts, but it's just that tyre management. It's been really poor lately.
Yeah, it has been. And that has been an inherent issue with this car for some time now. I know people don't want to draw comparisons to the new technical directive following the summer break, but that Ferrari was completely different animal to deal with after that compared to what it was at the start of the season. It didn't seem to have too many tyre problems. We went far back as Austria. It seemed to be the opposite, where they were good on their tyres and Red Bull weren't. So it's been a massive shift on that one. Lee, what are your thoughts on Ferrari this weekend? Are you echoing what Courtney has said, or do you think there's perhaps room for more optimism in the Ferrari camp?
I think they're going to struggle this weekend with the tyres. I mean, generally, Texas or Austin Grand Prix is a very hot track. And obviously, Ferrari are very good at heating up their tyres. And if it's hot and you're heating up your tyres, that's the last thing you want to do, because you're going to get blisters. And I don't want any tyre blowouts, which obviously I'm not saying there will be any tyre blowouts. But I think they're going to really struggle this weekend with just the heat, full stop in their car. And as you said, when we've been in last hot locations, it's been wet, be it Singapore or Suzuka, which has helped in the heat scene kind of things keep the temperatures low. But it's been as in hot what we're going to expect this weekend. It's early in the season when, as you said, Adam, Ferrari didn't have the tyre. So I think this is going to be a real challenge because they've just not had this kind of heat in dry conditions in daytime. And I think they're going to really struggle to extract the pace because of the tyres.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is going to be one of those races where Ferrari are going to be successful. There's going to be a need for safety car intervention and a little bit of luck as well. I'm certainly not doubting their pace. They certainly can challenge, but I just can't see that race car, the way that it chews up its tyres like a greedy kid in a sweet shop. It's just going to be so hard for them to manage it. I mean, we have to cast our minds back to 2018. Kimi Räikkönen putting in a stellar performance in his final victory for Ferrari, making the one-stop work when there wasn't much practice running, much data to go on the long run, so everyone was scrambling on the two-stopper. He made the one-stop work. He held back Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen in incredible fashion. It's a polar opposite scenario for Ferrari this weekend. I just can't see them repeating anything like that unless something crazy happens. So we'll have to hold out hope for them. But it very much does seem to be Red Bull all the way, unless the Mercedes upgrades provide some incredible package that all of a sudden is the world beater again, as it so often has been in the past. So I guess that leads to our final predictions, guys. Same format as always. For those of you new to the show, we give our top 3 finishes for this weekend and also a bold prediction. And as per tradition, Lee, you have the honours of going first. What are your top 3 this weekend, and do you have a bold prediction for us?
So top 3, I think, will be Sergio, Lewis, and Max. And the bold prediction is it's not really a bold prediction because I just revealed it. But I was going to say Max is not going to win this weekend, but that's not really bold when I've just said he's going to finish third.
It is these days, isn't it?
Bold.
Yeah, it is bold. I mean, he's won 12 races this year. I'd say that's pretty ballsy, to be honest.
Yeah, okay. Max to finish on the podium but not win. There you go. I thought you were going to not accept my bold prediction, which happens so many times.
Well, I'm having a hard time trying to think of one myself. I was leaning in that direction, but I can't really do that now that you've done it. But fair enough. Courtney, how about you?
I'm going to say Max first, Sergio Perez second, and I'm going to rank him third. Bold prediction, I'm going to repeat one that I said before, and I reckon a top 5 finish for Sebastian Vettel. I think he's going to get a big result before he goes out. It's going to happen. I can feel it.
Yeah, do you know what? It's crazy. I can feel it too. There's something about Sebastian Vettel where he's refound that something special about him, that special trait where he really can find a level of ability that very few that currently exist on the grid can match up to, and many before him have struggled to do the same as well. He produced some of that in Singapore, did something similar in Suzuka. I'm absolutely loving this. It's just such a shame that 4 races to go until we have to say goodbye to one of the all-time greats in the sport, and possibly Daniel Ricciardo as well, who, of course, we should not ignore because he loves coming to the States. They love him here. He really embraces that Texas heritage, that Texas characteristic that only true Texans will really understand. But Daniel really embraces that, so as he does so well wherever he travels. A very lovable character. Hopefully he does it well this weekend. I'm going to kind of agree with you guys to a degree. I think Checo, I'm going to say Checo to win. I think it's going to be one of those weekends, perhaps with an engine penalty, or Max gives him the benefit of the doubt to preserve P2, fighting along with Charles Leclerc right now, has the advantage, will want to retain that. So perhaps it's going to be his weekend this weekend to win again, as he did in Singapore. I think Max is going to come second, and I think P3, I'm going to go very bold. I'm going to say Lando Norris, P3 this weekend.
Ooh.
And believe it or not, Lando Norris is the only driver not driving one of the top 3 cars that has got on the podium this season. So I think he's going to do it again. Really going to go really bold out there. Why not? And plus, I really want to see. Bold. I want to see the fight with Alpine and McLaren go all the way. I feel like it needs a result like that to really level it up. They really dropped the ball in Suzuka and McLaren, so they really need to find a way to get back. Lando's been phenomenal this season. One of my drivers of the season, without doubt. So I really hope it happens. But we'll have to wait and see. Guys, that is pretty much all we've got time for in this episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode and the topics that we discussed. We went a different way this time. We wanted to focus more on some of the lesser teams on the grid. And of course, Mercedes as well. We shouldn't consider them in the same bracket, with all respect to them. So let us know what you think. And of course, let us know your thoughts, not only on the topics we discussed, but also on the Grand Prix this weekend. Get your predictions in the comments and try to go for something bold. Perhaps maybe a Norris podium, maybe something a bit more bold than that. If you can think of it, let us know. Of course, if you are new to the YouTube channel, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out a lot, and we'd really appreciate your support. Of course, if you're listening to us on your favourite podcasting platform, to support us, you can give us a 5-star review if you think that we are worthy on it. Just note that if you do give us a 5-star review on Spotify, then you'd need to let us know on our socials, which are either on the YouTube video or in the show notes in the description. Let us know. We'll give you a shout out on the next episode. The same goes, of course, if you give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We'll see that. We'll give you a shout out, I should say, on the next episode. But until next time, guys, we will be back reviewing the US Grand Prix. Hopefully, it's going to be a great one. But until then, we will see you in the next episode of the DNF1 podcast. So please do stay safe. And remember one thing, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.
See you soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.